Next, we will hear from Kent Calder, Director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Professor Calder is well regarded in the fields of diplomacy and academia as a leader at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Harvard, and other universities. He also served as special advisor to the United States Ambassador to Japan and was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Rays with neck ribbon. As Professor Calder will also be moderating our panel discussion directly after his lecture, we've asked that he sit in one of our cherry blossom cushion seats after his lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Calder to the stage.
Thanks very much, Momiko. It's a real pleasure to be here on a beautiful day like this and with hearing from so many people whom I've respected greatly over the years. I'd like to speak today to a subject that follows on from what we have heard in that it's a matter of connectivity. Of course, we've heard about travel, and we all love travel as one dimension of connectivity, of bringing us together. We've been watching a lot. I know I have, and with over the last several days, of course, the World Baseball Competition and the progression steadily toward a U.S.-Japan competition, and then the way that I thought very, very gracefully the two sides recognized the champions for the defending champion, recognized the new champion, Ohtani Shohei and his team, and again affirmed, I think, the ability of Japan and the United States to communicate with one another. And so certainly there are those dimensions. There's the travel, tourism, there's the shared experience like we've just seen. Then there's another dimension, cultural exchange, which I think is also, as someone who has been involved in this from various angles here in Washington, up on Capitol Hill for a while, teaching at other places in the United States, serving with U.S. Embassy Tokyo, seen it from several dimensions, and it certainly is an area with tremendous possibility and potential, affirming the same sort of things that we've also heard about in other areas today. There are also, though, important challenges, and we're going to be having a panel to discuss some of those just a little bit later on. But I did want to put cultural exchange and both the possibilities that it creates for the future and also the challenges that it faces in a larger context, namely the context of the broad sweep of Japan-U.S. relations. And I think the way to do that, I was thinking about what I might say, is really to go to the very first words of my mentor, Edwin Reischauer's, one of his most important books, The United States and Japan. He said, "Japan and the United States face each other, but only across the broadest ocean of them all." Of course, he was speaking figuratively and also literally. It is, as we all know, 13, 14 hours. Now with the Ukraine war, of course, it's even longer. It doesn't transit Russia, and it takes the long way around across the Pacific. It's a long ways across. But then, of course, our cultures, our backgrounds in many ways different. So there's a definite challenge there, which is really what I would like to address today. It's amplified, I think, by history. There was virtually no contact over the first 80 years of American history, 1776 to the coming of Perry's black ships in 1853. And of course, they were rejected. Perry had to go down to Okinawa and conclude a treaty before he could come back and actually get into Japan. After that, 1854 until into the 1920s, it was quite positive in many ways. And of course, highlighted by the Russia-Japanese War, the important role that Theodore Roosevelt, who thought so highly of Japan, just as the United States itself was running to a standing as a world power, that it played. And so his role in resolving the Russia-Japanese War that led to a Nobel Peace Prize for Roosevelt that has been for some time in the Roosevelt room of the White House was one major dimension of that. Of course, we had the tragic drift toward war in the 30s, landing ultimately to Pearl Harbor, and the tragic struggle, titanic struggle also after that. Over 3 million Japanese and over 250,000 Americans perished. But then, and I think so tellingly and so importantly, the post-war reconciliation that prevented Japan's partition. Korea and Germany, of course, were partitioned, and also delivered major support, both financial and then through the trade alternatives and the offering of opportunities for investment, that some of which Ambassador Schiffer mentioned, that came about in the new regime, free trade-oriented regime that was created. Now, that history, of course, led to another important development on the positive side. One of the real reasons why ultimately we need to strengthen the relationship is because of the strategic importance that has played. And of course, Ambassador Schiffer, Ambassador Kato, so many of our previous leaders and prime ministers, of course, over time as well, have played key roles in supporting that and strengthening its importance. But my point relative to my concern for cultural relations here is the uniqueness of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, both the fact that it has endured so long, it's now in its 73rd year, and it's only been revised once in 1960 by former Prime Minister Kishi, Ambassador Abe's grandfather, and also President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Christian Herter, whom I'm proud to say was one of the co-founders of our school at Johns Hopkins. But it has lasted a remarkable period of time. The direct analogy really is, I think, the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty of 1902, which lasted for a little more than 2 decades. But the U.S.-Japan Treaty has not only, it's lasted, it's become strengthened, more durable in many ways, but it's also unique. And in its way, I'm sure that Reischauer would say that. And my experience, which is not nearly as deep as Ambassador Schiffer or Kato or many of the real leaders, but enough to realize that it has its fragile dimensions as well. I think we have to remember, again, it's a cross-cultural alliance. There are economic dimensions, trade conflicts, and so on that can potentially complicate it. There obviously are new powers emerging in the system, of course, most prominently China. or declining powers, and I share some of what Ambassador Schiefer said about that, the Russians and so on. And but nevertheless, a great deal of complexity, a unique environment, and yet tremendous durability over the years. Now, but fragility, as I say. I think Reischauer, particularly because he was engaged at in the time of the shadow of the Security Treaty crisis of 1960. He was particularly conscious of this. But I remember in taking his courses, he talked so much about the 1930s and the erosion of democracy and volatility and lack of understanding, misperception, and so on across the Pacific at critical periods. And so I think we have to remember there's a fragility as well, which takes me to the main subject that I'd like to focus on very briefly, namely cultural exchange. The alliance has clearly proved itself time and time in both war and peace, as I mentioned. Several of our conflicts, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War of 1991, subsequent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Japan has provided both direct and indirect support in these conflicts, $13 billion to support the Gulf War effort in 1991. And of course, the Iraq conflict with boots on the ground in Iraq, among other things, during the Ambassador Schiefer's tenure. Of course, in peacetime, but in the time of tragedy, Japan and the United States also worked so closely together in the wake of the Tohoku earthquake of 2011. With the Ronald Reagan offshore and our forces working together to deal with the tragedy of that year. But the point I think that we also need to make is that the alliance would not be viable politically without broader understanding, given the lack of common historical experience and limited communication across most of that 170 years of our mutual history. So cultural exchange, which includes, of course, sports and travel, as we've already seen, plays a key role in that process. That brings me to a subject that I'd like to talk about briefly, having worked with Reischauer for many years right at the end of his career and co-taught with him and worked in the foundation of the U.S.-Japan program at Harvard University just as I was beginning my career. Many ambassadors and other leaders, of course, have contributed to the history of U.S.-Japan cultural exchange as they have to so many other aspects of our relationship. Ambassadors Tomita and Schiefer, whom we have with us have had speak with us today, have made major contributions, as did Ambassador Kato, Ambassador Mansfield, and others who have held that position before. The three ambassadors that I worked closely with, Ambassador Mansfield, Mondale, Ambassador Foley, and briefly Ambassador Baker, I would also say from direct experience, made major contributions. But I do want to say a few words about Reischauer, both because he was my own personal mentor and also because he initiated several of the cultural programs that are right at the heart of U.S.-Japan relations today. One of them, I hope that the pointer is going to work correctly here. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, actually, that was the celebration of the inauguration of CULCON, the Cultural Relations Committee on Cultural Communication which continues since Reischauer's day to meet to oversee academic and cultural relations between Japan and the United States. Reischauer created in U.S. Embassy Tokyo a cultural affairs minister position, which continued. It doesn't continue today, but many of the functions have continued in the public affairs officer, the PAO, who is one of the major ministers of the embassy. There was a tradition of high-level consultation that Reischauer supported strongly, that President Kennedy, of course, embraced. As many of you those of you who are old enough, and possibly one or two others may remember this, after the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the Secretary of State and Dean Ruskin, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, turned their plane around in midair and went back to Washington. They were headed to Tokyo for the cabinet-level consultation meeting between Japan and the United States. Reischauer, in coordination, of course, in the leadership of President Kennedy, did pioneer in that area. Public diplomacy. We can see Ambassador Reischauer with his wife, Haru Reischauer, who, of course, was the granddaughter, as many of you know, of one of Japan's most distinguished prime ministers. They appeared all over Japan. He normally had Nishiyama Sen do his translation for him, even though his Japanese was very fluent. But he engaged very, very actively all over Japan, as so many of our ambassadors have. He understood the importance of science and technology, the importance of scholarship. He visited Okinawa before the reversion of Okinawa itself. He believed the relations between Japan and Asia needed to be strengthened, and that he understood the delicate dimensions of those. And then finally, and something that I think is quite future-oriented, he believed that Japan needed to play a leading role in multilateral organizations worldwide. Of course, it needed a strong relationship with Washington, but also to broaden out and to become a important global citizen through those. He strongly supported Japan's membership, for example, in the OECD, which occurred during his ambassadorship. And that, of course, has continued on, and today we have Japan as the G7 chair at Hiroshima this coming May. I think there are important implications, just very briefly to, just rather than enumerating them in detail, but that I would like to note and that we're trying to build on today at the Reischauer Center. One of them on science and technology I mentioned. Space policy is an area that we are becoming involved with. The U.S. Space Force is establishing its major program at Johns Hopkins as we move to 555 Pennsylvania Avenue this coming fall. And that, the space dimension, is a part of the Reischauer heritage. Public diplomacy, we do a yearbook of U.S.-Japan relations, and certainly that aspect of the Reischauer heritage is important. Multilateral diplomacy, we have a new project on G7 that the question is how to keep some of the innovations that will develop at G7 in Hiroshima ongoing for the future as it moves to Italy and beyond. And then finally, the subject of international education. that was what Reischauer did his last book upon, just after he retired from Harvard University. And he was also chairman of a White House commission on that subject. And that really takes me to some subjects that I'd like to raise concretely for our panel as we move into that. I've been thinking about some issues in education, international education, particularly the important issue of how to bring more Japanese students and so on to the United States. As I said in the beginning, there unfortunately has been quite a sharp decline in the number of students in this country. It's actually the number of Japanese students currently in the U.S. is less than a third of what it was 20 years ago. Of course, that was at the time of the bubble, and so it was magnified. The issue was much easier, but there's been some change since then. There have been some important programs to try to offset that. As I began to look into this, two or three that seemed to be interesting to me. One was what's called Tobitate Ryugaku Japan, which is for subsidized, it's a public-private cooperation project involving subsidized overseas study for Japanese young people outward to the world, including, of course, the United States as one of the main elements. It has innovation programs, STEM programs, art and community service programs. It's creative and interesting, and I wonder where it's headed. It seems to have had some financial difficulties, but it would seem to be a promising thing. The Tobitate Kyoshi program, it's for teachers, to bring teachers from Japan of Japanese language and other areas to schools in the United States, university students, graduate students. We were talking, my wife and I were talking, who's a specialist in this area. In New York City, for example, there are teachers of this sort. Dallas, Texas, as well, has Tabitate Kyoshi. Sister cities in both countries are adopting this program. The Mansfield Fellows Program. It's one of the great successes of U.S.-Japan relations, and there are also Japanese officials now in the United States. Are there ways that program can be built on? The JET program, of course. Many of our students at Johns Hopkins and the people who are really going on into leadership positions in U.S.-Japan have been members of JET in the past. Are those things possibilities for the future? So what I come back to ultimately in conclusion is really the words of Reischauer once again, and to that fundamental challenge which is presented by history and to our current realities for the U.S.-Japan relationship. Our countries face each other only across an ocean, but it's the broadest ocean of them all. So what will we do to further narrow that ocean, to transcend that ocean, to move into an era of closer relations between our two countries? I think that's the important challenge and an enduring challenge that faces us across the Pacific. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。